Hey guys, we're back in the app here. So the next thing I'll do is I'll actually create a new file and we're going to call it store.js. Now this file will basically contain the initial data set for the exercises. And it's also going to contain a list of categories for the muscles. So let's do a number of things here. I'm going to do export constant muscles. And this will basically be a list of body parts. Okay, so we're gonna have shoulders, we're gonna have chest, we're gonna have arms, let's also do back, and maybe legs. Okay, so like I said, this would be a list of muscles that we can categorize the exercises by, and the list of exercises themselves would be, well, of course, a list of exercises, and this is going to be an array as well. Now here we're gonna have a list of objects, and I'm thinking every exercise would have a title, right? It might also have a description, and then we'll also have the muscles themselves. So this muscles property would be one of those categories from above. And we're also going to have an ID, right? And we're going to need this for the key property when we're basically iterating over the exercises inside of the app. So I think this is good enough for an exercise object. And like I said, we're basically simplifying things here. Of course, every exercise will involve a bunch of different muscles in it. And of course, the categories themselves are also composite, meaning there's different muscles involved. But for the sake of demo, we're going to keep it simple and we're just going to narrow it down to those 5 different body parts. And the exercises are also going to be targeted at one of those body parts specifically, okay? Right, so I went ahead and created a list of exercises here, basically 1 or 2 for each of the categories. And I'm actually going to include the link to this repo so that you can actually open it up and copy over the list of exercises for your demo. But for the time being, we're going to move on to layout footer. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually display the list of categories inside of the footer. Now, the first thing we need to do though is we need to grab those muscles, those categories basically, as well as the exercises themselves, and we need to import them from the store. So let's grab the muscles. Let's also grab the exercises from the store. So we need to go one level above. Let's save that. Now the muscles themselves are going to be static, so that's one of the assumptions we're going to make. The list of categories is not going to change throughout the app. However, the list of exercises might actually change because we'll be adding exercises, editing them, as well as deleting them. So the exercises themselves need to go to the state, okay? So I'm going to pass on the exercises to the state on this app.js class. And this would be a container component that basically passes down all of the data to all the other components. They're going to be functional and they're going to be also presentational. So they're basically going to accept the data as props and they're just going to display it, whatever the props happen to be at the time of rendering. Now for the muscles, we're actually going to pass them down to the footer. So let's have muscles, and that's going to be equal to the muscles themselves. So let's move on to the footer now. And like I said, the properties are going to contain the muscles. Now what we can do with the muscles is we can actually map through them. So I'm going to say, let's have the muscles, and we're going to map through them. We're going to get a set of muscles for that callback, okay? And even though I'm calling it muscles as well, you can call it anything. You can call it a category or a group. Actually, let's call it a group just for clarity. But you could also call it muscles, and the reason it works is those muscles are only going to be accessible within that callback function. So nothing else on the outside is going to be affected by that. And once we do that, let's grab one of the tabs here, and I'm actually going to use a different label. So the label would basically be the muscle group from that map function, okay? And the rest of them can go. Okay, let's save that. And as you can see here, we get a list of different body parts. Now the one thing I'll do though is I'm actually going to copy over this tab, and I'm going to copy it over here. And instead of an object, I'm actually going to pass a string, and I'm going to call it all. So this would be the very first tab, and as you can see here, it gets selected because we hard-coded the index of 0 to the tabs. And the reason I want to do that is, well, if you select all from the list of tabs, you're going to be able to see all of the different categories. But let's say if you click on shoulders, you're only going to be able to select the list of shoulder exercises, okay? And the list of exercises themselves, we're probably going to put it on the left pane over there. So let's go back to app.js, and we're going to need to pass down those exercises in there. So exercises equals something. Now the thing about this is, of course, we have a list of exercises, right? Back in the store, we've basically got a list of unordered objects that pertain to different categories, and they're really not sorted by anything. Now the problem with that is, like I said, if I just remove this for the time being, I bring it back, like I said, we have different categories that pertain to different muscle groups. And I would like to be able to display, or basically sort, the list of exercises depending on the category that's being selected. Now, in order to do that, well, we can't do it in the moment because the list of exercises, like I said, is not ordered. So we're going to have to play with the data before we actually pass it to the exercises component. Now, of course, we could do the flattening inside of index.js or whatever, but because we are inside of the container itself, I'd like to keep that responsibility for app.js or app component itself. So let's create another method. I'm going to call it get exercises by muscles, okay? Or you could call it by category, by group, whatever the case might be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually return this state exercises, and we're going to need to play with that a little bit. Well, first of all, let's do console log of that. So let's first call that method, and let's open up the console. Let's see what it's going to give us. I'm going to save the file. And it looks like I made a typo. Of course, it's not states. What was I thinking about? It's state, and we're basically assigning the exercises on it. Okay, so we get a list of objects here. And as you might expect, these are basically all of the different exercise objects that we define in this store. So if anything in the store changes, if the initial data set changes, it's also going to affect the state. Now, this is not enough, of course. So we need to transform that state somehow. And what we're actually going to do is we're actually going to reduce that state to something else. And in fact, it's going to be an object. And when you call the reduce function like that, it's going to expect a callback as the first parameter with a function. Now that callback is going to receive a number of arguments. The very first one would be the accumulator itself. I'm not going to call it the exercises. And the second parameter would be the object that's being looped over at the moment. So if you go back to the store, so when we're looping through all the different exercises, for example, the very first element would be this object over here. So back in app.js, this would be exactly that object. And what do we actually want to do here? Well, first of all, let's get the muscles from the exercise. And by the way, the muscles would obviously be the muscles property here. So for example, shoulders or arms, okay? We're just going to destructure it. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, we've got the exercises. The problem here is that the exercises variable is first going to be assigned the value of the very first element that we are reducing on this array. So when you call reduce, our very first iteration, it's going to get the value of the exercise object. So in this case, it's going to be overhead press, this guy over here, and it's going to assign that value to exercises. That's not exactly what we want to do. In fact, what we actually want to use as the initial value, and you can actually see the description for that second parameter popping up, but the default value, like I said, is going to be an empty object. And the next thing we'll do is we'll grab that object and we're going to assign a property on it. And the property on it would be the muscles. So for instance, arms or chest or back, okay? And we actually want to assign it conditionally. So I'm going to say, do we already have something stored in that property at the moment? Well, if we do, it's actually going to be an array. And we need to spread out the elements from that array into a new array. Okay, so it's going to create another array. And lastly, we're just going to pass the exercise object itself into it. Otherwise, we're going to create a new array with the exercise alone, like that, okay? And finally, we need to return the exercises themselves, okay? So let's save that and let's actually see what the output becomes. So in the past, if you remember, we were getting a list of different objects, basically an array, just the exact same thing as the exercises from the store. But now we're actually getting an object that contains all the different body parts, and those body parts contain all the different exercises that pertain to them, okay? So now what we've basically done is we've created an object that is containing all the different exercises sorted by the category or the body part. And this is exactly what we want. However, the problem with the object is we cannot really map over that object at the moment. So if I want to go to exercises and I want to pass down the exercises and basically loop through them in the left pane, well, I can't really do that because the exercises that we return in the end from the reduce function becomes an object, and we can't really iterate over in an object with the map function as we do with the arrays. So what I'm actually going to do, the very last thing, I'm going to call object entries. And object entries is a fantastic method from ES8, I believe, one of the latest editions of ECMAScript. And what this object does is, well, let's actually open up the console and let's see what we get. We get an array that contains a bunch of different arrays inside of it, so basically subarrays. Well, let's see what the very first one is. We get an array that contains the category, for instance, shoulders, and we also get another array that contains the list of all of the exercises pertaining to that category, okay? And what we can actually do with that is we can actually iterate over the largest array, or the basically wrapper array, in order to display all the different elements inside of the left pane, like I said. So now with all of that transformation out of the way, let's actually grab this call. I'm going to create a constant here. I'm going to call it exercises. And we're going to get the exercises from that method, okay? And finally, we're going to pass the exercises to the exercises component, okay? So let's pass it down. And like I said in index.js, let's first of all refactor it a little bit. Now, I thought about it, I'm actually not going to have any panes here because a lot of the stuff is basically going to be duplicated, and I don't think it makes much sense to do it. So let's bring it back to the paper element, and I'm going to keep left pane there for now. And I'm just going to copy it over, and I'm going to create a right pane. So same thing here. And the styles object, well, we already have that. I'm going to kill those two panes. And the one thing that's missing is the paper element at the moment. I'm going to save index.js, and we can remove left pane, and we can also remove the right pane. Okay. So now we actually get a props object. So I don't need the whole thing, of course. I just need the exercises for the time being. Now, what do we actually want to do with that? Well, we want to iterate over them. So let's do exactly that. I'm going to call the map function right now. So let's provide a callback inside. And that callback is actually going to receive an array, but I'm actually going to destructure it. So I'm going to get the group or the category. You can think of it as a body part. And I'm going to get all the different exercises that pertain to that specific group. Now, in this case, the exercises here is not going to overwrite the other exercises that we get from the props. It's actually going to mask those exercises within the callback. Because within the callback, I don't actually need to get hold of the whole entire exercises object that we get as the props. I just need to get those specific exercises that pertain to my specific group that we are iterating over at the moment. So once we get that, I'm going to actually create a typography element here. Okay. The typography element is going to be sort of like the title for that category or group. So I'm just going to say group, okay. And we are going to need to get that typography element, of course. Okay, let's say that. So as you can see here, we get a list of different categories or body parts. Now let's actually go to the documentation of Material UI. So I'd like to see some of the options that we can use for that typography element. So let's go to get started. Let's actually go to style typography. And over here, as you can see, we've got all these different elements. Now the one I'm interested in, the headline. So over here, typography with the variant of headline. So that's the one I'll use. So let's have a typography element. I'm gonna set variant to headline. Let's save it. Now the other thing I'll do is I'm also going to pass an inline style object here, and I'm going to say text transform to capitalize. So we're just basically going to capitalize those categories. Okay. Now the next thing we also need to do is I'd like to have a list of the exercises just below the different categories. So let's go to component demos, and we're going to head over to lists. And we can open up the very first one. Of course, there's a bunch of different examples here that we can use, and we can tweak it eventually, but for now, I'm just going to grab a list here with the very primitive, simple markup. I'm going to paste it over here. Now, first things first, we need to import, actually, the list we can get from Material UI itself, but for the other ones, for example, list item, as well as list item text, well, that actually needs to come from a bit of a different path. We need to also have a list in the end. And one thing I'll mention though for the time being is there's actually a proposal to flatten the path for all of the different components inside of the library. Meaning that if you import, let's say, list item or list item text, you won't have to have a postfix of /list. So in the future, it's very probable that you just need to do that same thing, but from Material UI, so that you can actually copy over these elements and just put them over there on the same line, so that you don't have to, like I said, have the list postfix at the end. But for the time being, this is what the library provides us with. If there's the breaking change, I'll let you know in the comments down below, so just stay tuned, or just make sure to go back to the documentation and check yourself. Okay, but I'm going to save that for the time being, and of course we get an error here because we need a wrapping element, and for that I'm going to use a fragment, a very convenient element that React provides itself, and I'm going to wrap the typography with the fragment and the list, of course, with the fragment. I'm going to have the closing tag. Let's indent this and let's save it. Now for the component on the list itself, I'm actually going to use an unordered list. And finally, what we need to do is we need to map through those exercises. Okay, let's call the map function. We're going to get the exercise object. And finally, once we do that, we can actually output the list item for each of the exercises, right? And that can go away, with that. And for the text, we can actually pass the title of the exercise. So let's actually grab it from the object. So I'm going to need to use those parentheses and the curly braces. I'm going to extract the title from there, and let's save that. And as you can see here on the left, we get a list of different exercises. Now for the right pane, I'm actually going to do the following. So let's have a few typography elements here. Let's close that off and let's copy it. What I'd like to do here is, well, if you select an exercise from the list, we're going to display the title and description, basically the details of that exercise. But when you land on the page, of course, nothing is selected by default. So we're basically going to have a simple welcome message, I think. And let's have a variant over here. I'm going to pass a variant equals display 1, for instance. Okay. Now for the second one, this would be a paragraph. Actually, if we go back to the documentation, let's go back to demos. Actually, it's in style typography. So for the actual text, we could use body, or we could even use subheading. So I'm gonna say variant gonna be equal to subheading. And for the text, let's actually put something like this. Please select an exercise from the list on the left. Okay, let's say that. And maybe we could also add a margin. So maybe I'll include a style. This would be an object. And we're just gonna pass margin top. That's gonna be, for instance, 20 pixels. Okay, doesn't look too bad. Now the only thing is I'd like to make this pane the same height as the first one. So maybe I'm gonna give both of them a static height, maybe 500 pixels. And as you can see here, it's actually gonna cut off the list of exercises. So I'm gonna do overflow Y, and I'm gonna set it to auto. That's gonna allow our list of exercises to be scrollable. And I'm just gonna adjust this thing over here, all the different styles, so that it's nice and clean and readable. Oops, let's bring back the como. Let's adjust that. Okay, so that looks pretty good for the time being, so we can save that.